Nobody expected Barron Trump to stop. The New York streets were packed that evening, businessmen rushing to late meetings, tourists marveling at the towering skyline, yellow taxis weaving through traffic. It was the kind of chaotic energy that made the city feel alive. And then, him. A man sat on the corner of 5th Avenue and 56th Street, his back leaning against a cold concrete wall. His military-issued duffel bag rested beside him, his weather jacket barely shielding him from the bitter wind cutting through the city. He wasn't just any homeless man. His dog tag still hung from his neck. His boots, worn but still laced perfectly, spoke of a man who once walked with discipline. His eyes, though sunken with exhaustion, still held the sharpness of a soldier. And yet nobody noticed him. Or rather, they chose not to. Pedestrians walked past, avoiding eye contact as if looking at him would make their expensive clothes feel heavier. The wealthy socialites clutching designer handbags, the businessmen checking stock prices on their phones, none of them stopped. None of them cared, until he walked by. Barron Trump. The 6 feet 7 inches figure moved through the crowd with an ease that suggested he was used to standing out. A long black coat wrapped around his frame, his hands tucked into his pockets as he strolled down the street. He wasn't surrounded by bodyguards, no security detail in sight, just him. He had every reason to keep walking. He had places to be. Yet for some reason he stopped. He glanced down at the man sitting on the curb, their eyes meeting for the first time. Barron's gaze wasn't pitying, wasn't condescending. It was curious. The veteran noticed immediately. He had seen this look before, not from rich businessmen or politicians, but from soldiers, from men who had seen things they couldn't unsee. Barron knelt down, his towering frame now closer to the man's level. He studied him for a second before finally speaking. "How long have you been out here?" The man blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He wasn't used to being acknowledged. He cleared his throat. "Too long." Barron nodded, his expression unreadable. "Army?" The man exhaled through his nose. "Marines." Barron's gaze flickered to the dog tags hanging from his neck. He nodded again, as if confirming something in his mind. "What's your name?" Barron asked. The veteran hesitated. "James," he finally muttered. Barron extended a hand. "Nice to meet you, James." James stared at the outstretched hand. He had been ignored by thousands of people this week alone. And yet here was Barron Trump, a billionaire's son, a man who had every reason to ignore him, offering a handshake like they were equals. Slowly, James took his hand. Barron's grip was firm, the kind of handshake that carried weight. "What do you need, James?" James exhaled. "If I had to choose," he chuckled bitterly, "a job." Barron's lips pressed together slightly, as if processing the answer. "Where were you stationed?" James raised an eyebrow. "You really want to know?" Barron didn't blink. "Yeah." James studied him for a second before sighing. "Afghanistan, 1st Battalion. I was an engineer. Demolitions." Barron tilted his head slightly. "So you know logistics, problem-solving, operations." James let out a dry laugh. "That's one way to put it." Barron glanced at the duffel bag beside him. "When's the last time you had a meal?" James shrugged. "Today, maybe yesterday." Barron reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a sleek black leather wallet. James tensed. "Look, man, I'm not asking for money." "I'm not giving you money," Barron interrupted. James paused. "Then what are you?" "Come with me." James blinked. "What?" Barron stood up, adjusting his coat. "Let's get dinner." James furrowed his brows. "Why?" Barron's expression didn't change. "Because I don't make job offers on the street." James laughed again, this time more out of disbelief. "A job?" Barron nodded. "Yeah." James shook his head, looking around as if expecting cameras, some kind of setup. "You serious?" Barron raised an eyebrow. "Would I be wasting my time if I wasn't?" James didn't have an answer for that. People didn't do this. Rich men didn't do this. Yet here was Barron Trump, standing in front of him, offering something no one else had. A chance. James slowly grabbed his duffel bag, pushing himself up. His legs ached. Years of rough living had done that to him. But for the first time in years, he felt something strange. something he had forgotten existed. Hope. Barron gestured toward the end of the street. There's a steakhouse around the corner. Let's talk there. James hesitated before shaking his head with a smirk. I'd settle for a burger. Barron grinned. Fine. Burgers then? The two men started walking down the street side by side. People in the crowd stared, confused, whispering among themselves. Barron Trump didn't care. He wasn't doing this for attention. He wasn't doing this for PR. He was doing this because it was the right thing to do. And James, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't invisible anymore. The burger joint wasn't fancy. It wasn't some five-star reservations-only restaurant with dim lighting and $200 entrees. It was a simple diner, the kind with red vinyl booths, faded menus stuck between ketchup bottles, and the faint smell of grease lingering in the air. And yet for James, it might as well have been heaven. As soon as they stepped inside, heads turned. It wasn't every day that someone like Barron Trump walked into a place like this, tall, composed, dressed in a tailored coat that probably cost more than the entire building. But he didn't seem fazed by the attention. James, on the other hand, was very aware of it. He had spent so long being ignored that now, with people actually noticing him, he felt almost exposed. Barron slid into a booth near the back, nodding toward the opposite seat. Go ahead. James hesitated, then slowly sat down. A waitress, no older than 20, stared at Barron for a long moment before quickly pulling out her notepad. Can I get you gentlemen something to drink? Barron didn't even look at the menu. Water's fine. James cleared his throat. Same. The waitress nodded, stealing one last glance at Barron before hurrying away. James smirked. You get that a lot? Barron leaned back against the booth. Depends. James raised an eyebrow. On? Barron glanced toward the window, where a few curious onlookers were still trying to sneak a look inside. On whether they like my last name or not, James chuckled dryly. Yeah, guess that comes with the territory. The waitress returned, setting down their drinks. You guys ready to order? Barron gestured to James. Go ahead. James glanced at the menu but didn't even need to look. He had memorized it already. When you spent years surviving on the streets, you knew every cheap meal in the city. Double cheeseburger, fries, extra pickles. The waitress scribbled it down. And for you, sir? Barron set his menu aside. I'll have the same. As the waitress walked away, James shook his head, smirking. Didn't take you for a burger and fries kind of guy. Barron shrugged. I don't care what's on the plate as long as the conversation's good. James leaned back, studying him for a long moment. All right, let's hear it then. Barron took a sip of water. How long were you in? James sighed. 12 years. Barron nodded. Why'd you leave? James's fingers tensed slightly around his glass. Didn't have a choice. Barron didn't push. Injury? James exhaled through his nose. PTSD. The words hung between them. Barron didn't react with pity or the usual awkward silence that followed when most people heard the term. Instead, he just nodded again. That's rough. James let out a dry laugh. That's an understatement. The waitress returned, dropping their plates in front of them. The smell of real food hit James like a punch to the gut. His stomach growled loudly and he didn't waste a second. The first bite was heaven. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Forgot that just an hour ago, he had been sitting on the curb. Just another ghost in a city that refused to see him. Barron took a slow bite of his burger, watching him. How long have you been looking for work? James wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve. Too long. You got experience? James smirked. I built roads, set up base camps in hostile zones, handled logistics under fire, moved convoys through active war zones. So yeah, I'd say I got experience. Barron stirred his drink with his straw. So what's stopping you? James gestured toward himself. Look at me. Barron did. James chuckled bitterly. No suit, no clean shave, no fancy resume. You think corporate America gives a damn about military experience, unless it's the kind that looks good on a diversity hire pamphlet? Barron took another bite. I think some people don't know how to spot real talent. James scoffed. And you do. Barron's expression didn't change. I know what it's like to be underestimated. James studied him. He had heard every line in the book from politicians, business moguls, and rich kids who wanted to sound like they cared. But for some reason, Barron didn't sound like he was selling anything. He sounded like he meant it. James leaned forward. All right, cut to the chase. Why are we really here? Barron wiped his hands with a napkin, then reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a business card. James frowned, taking it. The name on it wasn't Trump. It was a private security firm. James looked back up. What is this? Barron rested his arms on the table. A second chance. James felt his heartbeat pick up slightly. This isn't a handout, Barron continued. If you take the job, you earn it. No favors, no special treatment. But from what you just told me, you're more qualified than half the guys they hire. James's fingers tightened around the card. He wanted to believe it, but hope was a dangerous thing when you had been kicked down so many times before. His voice came out hoarse. Why me? Barron's expression was unreadable. Because I saw you. The words hit James harder than he expected. Barron pushed his plate aside, standing up. The number's on the card. Call it. James swallowed. And if I don't? Barron tossed some cash onto the table to cover the bill. Then I guess I'll see you around. He turned, walking toward the door. James looked down at the card in his hand. His fingers ran over the embossed letters. He had a choice. For the first time in years, he had a real choice. And as he sat in that diner, staring at the card, something in his chest shifted. Hope. For the first time in a long, long time. It felt real, and he wasn't about to waste it. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below.